Welcome to Southern Waters. This panel centres upon the wet and the dry. I'm Meg Samuelson and I'm speaking to you from the unceded lands and seas of the Kaurna people on what is now known as the Fleurieu Peninsula of South Australia, and I pay my respects to elders and custodians of this country. I'm delighted to be in conversation with the dazzling novelist Yvonne Adiyombo-Awuah, who lives and writes in Nairobi usually, but who's joining us today from Berlin, where she's currently on residency. And joining us from Johannesburg, three colleagues in literary studies who have been among my most generative guides and fellow travellers in thinking through water: Isabel Hofmeyr, Sean Lavery, and Sarah Nuttall. So pleased to have you here with us. I do want to acknowledge that our colleagues in Johannesburg are currently subject to the travel ban that Australia has imposed on Southern Africa, explicitly following the lead of the advanced economies of the Northern Hemisphere. This symposium evokes Southern Waters as a framework for thinking between the land masses of the South, but the ban presents us with a salient reminder of the fault lines and the borders that also cut across them. Before we turn to thinking through wetness and dryness per se, and before I turn to my interlocutors, I just want to briefly sketch out three cartographies for bringing wetness and dryness into conjunction within the broader framework of Southern Waters. And this is to signal some of my interest in assembling this panel, but these cartographies are by no means intended to contain the conversation, which is going to be wide-ranging. And Rachel, if you could, yes, please share my first slide. I think it's number 27. Perfect. But firstly, I'm interested in the littoral zone, in which the dance of land and sea, or wet and dry, gives shape to what I've tried to think of as amphibian aesthetics, coastal form, and coastal thought. And to think about how these settings create quite different orientations to the world in different aesthetic forms, or create different kinds of pressure on literary form to those that are centered either on the land or out at sea. And I'm particularly interested in the dough cultures of the Swahili coast, which Yvonne will introduce us to. If I can have the next slide, please, Rachel. Secondly, Sean Lavery and I have sketched out a cartography of what we've called the Oceanic South, which we approached by tilting the globe to center Antarctica, and thus thinking our way into the south from the frozen continent that holds most of the planet's potable water, and through the vast expanses of the Southern Ocean to the dispersed and often arid little strips of land in the Southern Hemisphere that appear to be almost engulfed in water and may be increasingly so as Antarctic ice melts. And looking at the world from this perspective requires us to contend with both wetness and dryness to degrees that the projections that inflate the Euro-Atlantic world simply do not. And thirdly, my next slide, please, Rachel. My final cartography is a still provisional one that I'm trying to develop, and it takes a structure from the Indian Ocean dipole, which is a recently identified ocean atmosphere coupling system that's currently intensifying and is becoming the primary climate driver in the land masses surrounding the Indian Ocean. So it's choreographing, which is what is now a catastrophic dance of flood and drought between Australia, Eastern Africa, South and Southeast Asia. Effectively, when Australia burns, Eastern Africa floods, and vice versa. So these oscillating wet and dry conditions are hugely suggestive to me of ways in which you might organize and analyze the literature of this region. In broad strokes then, I'm interested in the question of how to foreground, think with, create with, and give form to wetness and dryness in relation to southern lands. They are both exposed to far greater bodies of water than the north, whether that water is washing in from the sea or falling from the sky, and which are also at the same time becoming more arid. So both Australia and Africa are warming and drying at a much faster rate than the global average. The next one, please, Rachel. And so, I'm so pleased to have Ivana Wur in this conversation because her two novels together exemplify ways of writing through the sea on one hand and writing in arid states on the other. So we're going to start this conversation with the wet, and we'll turn a little bit later to the dry. Now I want to ask Ivana Wur to launch us into Swahili seas with some introduction to her novel, The Dragonfly Sea. Can we get the next slide of that, Rachel? And it's set on the islands of Pate,
yes,
in the Lamu archipelago of mainland Kenya, as well as in the Indian Ocean itself, or in as well as across, and in China. And Yvonne, I'm so interested in how, in writing through the sea, you're able to unfurl the expansive narrative canvas of what one blurb calls this continent-hopping novel of epic proportions, while at the same time introducing other voices that bubble up from the undersea. We'll talk a bit about those voices.
Right.
The narrative also exemplifies, what I think of as coastal form, because it's structured by the ebb and flood of tides. And I wonder whether you'd like to tell us a bit about the coastal world that you're writing of and from, and how it's opening to the sea, how it's opening to the tides, introduces a different form to that conventionally linear narrative in which you might otherwise have scripted Ananya's coming of age.
Thank you, Meg, and it's such a pleasure to be with everyone here. Meg, you actually make me feel very, very clever. I hope I'm not disheartening people when I say just simply, it comes from a sense. Primarily, this is a love story, my own particular love for the sea, actually particularly the Indian Ocean or the Swahili Sea, just to be a little bit provocative, which you probably have heard the story of my meeting the ocean when I was 7 years old, and have remained ocean haunted ever since. Even when I'm in cities like Berlin or Nairobi, there's not a day in which I do not long for the sea. So the instinct as well as the embodied longing of something so splendid, so spectacular, perhaps also undergirds and informs the particular choice of the waters. There's no way that I can ever write the ocean, particularly the Indian Ocean, in a way that's not like a praise song, and that's because of the effect of love. But having said that, growing up with a greater awareness of a kind of patrimony, the patrimonies of the sea. And that became very important for me when I was working as executive director of the Zanzibar International Festival, not just in close proximity to the sea, with a daily view of the sea, with a life that was impinged by the tide news and the currents and the idea of the sea in conversation. It's almost a silent conversation with society and with a person that I don't think we're always very much aware of, how we adapt and move our bodies because of the way the sea is, the mood of the sea, the way our bodies and eyes turn towards the waters, right? And I lived there for 3 years, and it was enough to become aware of what I did not know and what I was not aware of, but also the idea of the long historical patrimonies, particularly the African patrimonies that seem to have maybe in the last 100 years been kind of either written out or written over. And the tangibility of that, I think, not just remained with me, became the kind of questions I started to ask. What does it mean to be African? What does it mean to have this maritime heritage and patrimony that in certain cases, some of our governments turned their backs against the seas. The post-independent governments turned their backs against the sea. What gets lost? What gets gained? And then this particular story emerges, but it emerges at a time when I started to question again the narrative of China's return. At that time, when I was writing the book, when I started off on the book, I was not calling it China's return. I was caught up in the skies falling on Africa's head narrative that was going out. But what I wanted to know was actually what do those who are in close proximity to the sea and to this China, Africa, oceanic history, what are they actually saying? And you know, the search yields a story of Dr. Muammar Sharif, 2005 DNA testing affirms that she is connected to some of the sailors that were survived the Admiral Zheng He's last voyage in the 15th century. And there's this kind of 600-year-old footnote, and in which she's taken to China. She goes to China and is treated very much as not just a descendant, but a treasure. And a kind of a person who returns the spirits of that which was lost, which the culture imagined had been lost to the seas. I was surprised that we had not paid too much attention to that as a country, Kenya, and even as a continent, because there are immense implications to this particular story. And then I ended up on Pate Island, and there you see the resonances of the long histories. There you see the in the bodies of the people, in the cultural habits that have become things of Pate Island. You meet people with all the heritages that are linked to a long history of trade, connection, and relationship. You know, Portuguese, those of Portuguese descent, those of Chinese descent, those of Indian descent, and it's all there. Everyone's there on Pate Island, but everybody then also lives with a kind of a strong and profound Pate identity. The prominence of the Swahiliness, the Swahili being takes over, although they prefer to call themselves Bajuni, but all interlinked. With the confluence, the confluence that the thing that language gives very much in mirroring the lives of the sea, and to end, since you talked about tides, and I hadn't noticed how much this book was about the ebb and flow, but it would be amiss if I did not mention the late Haji Gora Haji, the great poet and minstrel of these particular seas, who was my primary interlocutor, very much my old.
Can I just interrupt? Do you want Rachel to scroll through the slides?
Oh, she can. She can. I'll just talk over. Yes. They'll just run. Let them run. Yeah.
Right. Just scroll through them, Rachel. The next set. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So you talking about Haji.
I was just concluding that Haji Gora Haji, I remember when I'd gone to him and to doing the research for this book, which by the way I did in Australia. I owe Australia the Dragonfly Sea quite a bit. Let me be more precise, Brisbane. What I was going to say is, I remember when I've gone to Haji Gora and says, I said, Mzee, I think, the Chinese are coming. And, that kind of like, the sky's falling on your head, chicken licking kind of thing. And he was very, he kind of says, and so it was his kind of this very laconic, and so what's your issue? I mean, he was trying to what do you call it, comfort whatever my panic was. And I remember, and one of the, there he is, may he rest in peace, the beautiful man. And he said, he told me, people come, people go, people come, people go. So what's your problem? Oh, and that's Dr. Muammar Sharif. She was the one who was sent to China, and this was our first meeting on the Pate waterfront. Yeah, and that's her mother. Yeah. So that's the kind of context. Yeah.
And tell us about these voices that come from the undersea.
The lie. Oh my! I think I don't know if any of you have been to the East African coast. One of the things you cannot avoid is the complexity of the sense of the complexity and the immensity of the lives of the waters, and that the waters are a cosmos in themselves, and there's an above as well as a below, and the world below incorporates the world below has its own kind of, I don't know, system, its own amphibious system of life. So the voices of what they call the jinns, who live beneath the waters, the idea of worlds beneath the waters, and the idea of a bit like the in-between spaces. This is the other story. The in-between spaces of space are worlds, are also worlds within themselves. So the idea of the in-between spaces within the waters, where other worlds live. And sometimes and this was according to Haji Gora Haji, there are times you need to know when to listen, and the times you need to know when to block your ears. Otherwise, you will be drawn into beneath the surfaces, into worlds that you're not supposed to be a part of. But what I love about what is so fascinating, and maybe that becomes part of the hauntedness, my own hauntedness, as an artist and as somebody who I do claim Swahili Sea citizenship again. The idea of the mystery and the pleasure, and I think one of Haji Gora's poems is about that, the recondite sea. That which you think you know, you actually do not know, and that which you think you have kind of skewered. The seas, because of the tides, will absolutely rewrite that which you think you have established for yourself. So I think, and I think, and you asked a very important question, Meg, when you said, what does opening ourselves to the waters actually mean? It shouldn't it be a kind of the way, it shouldn't be the way we kind of operate, because first of all, we're mostly made up of water, one, but secondly, the infinite beauty and wonder and mystery that the waters represent, the life-giving, as well as sometimes, yes, it's true, the danger. We know what happened with the tsunami. Our lack of openness to the waters ensured that those of us who were far from our connections and dialogue, conversation with the waters, ended up with profound and immense and catastrophic losses. Those who were close to the waters read the signs long in advance, a day in advance, and moved to higher ground. So our opening to the water not just enriches our lives, but makes us bigger, and I think humbler as well.
Lovely, thank you so much. We're going to come back to this beautiful book, to Undersea and Coastal Worlds, but I want us to turn now to Sean Lavery. Sean, your new book, I think it's hitting the shelves in the next 10 days, is that right? Maritime Ocean Worlds is the first extended and consolidated study of Indian Ocean fiction, the, I suppose, generation that just precedes Yvonne's work. Yvonne's work is gestured to it as the next layer of writing in this world. And I wonder, Sean, can you talk us through some of the conceptual shifts and reorientations that are entailed in convening and analysing a body of literature from this ocean basin? To pose the question otherwise, what happens when we push world literature out to sea, or world literary formations out to sea, but also more particularly into this particular ocean basin that we are located around?
Thanks, Meg. The book is coming out, but this is my first book, so I'm not used to the timelines, which are operating actually between, as far as I can tell, India and England, north-south Indian Ocean connections. There's actually quite a strange team of people around the Indian Ocean who are involved in proofreading the book at the moment. So hopefully in 10 days, but I actually can't exactly say. One of the things that two of the things actually that I really, when I was trying to rewrite the book and figure out a way to conclude it, what's the why about the book? One of them was Meg's concept of wider worlds, that what the different novels bring is the sense of a much wider world than the parochial, land-bound, inward-looking, what Yvonne was saying about the post-independence nation turning away from the sea, and I think also relationally, drawing also on Tina Steiner's work, on each other, turning our back on connections that had, yes, sorry, I was drawing on Meg's theorization, but it does come from Gerner. I guess the sense that there's like a bigger world out there, and one that means that it pushes back also. So that's the kind of geographic concept, but it also pushes back very much against any progressivist or teleological view of history. So again, what Yvonne is saying about this kind of notion of the tides, the tidalectics, that this is not China's entry into Africa, but China's return. And the scholar who goes across to China, it's also her return. So this kind of back and forth, that these are connections both found and lost again. I think, I'm also probably getting that from Gerner. And then the other thing I used to conclude was actually Yvonne's recounting of her experience working at the Zanzibar Film Festival. And there, she says, it did quite a mind job on me. It expanded my idea of where Africa begins and ends. This is in I think an event last year, Yvonne. And what has been lost, but also can be refound, this patrimony that can be rediscovered. And therefore actually shifts the mental map of who various people are, what the boundaries of their like possible futures can be. So that, in one way it's a book about novels about not the nation, the yes. anti-national novel. And in other ways, it's a book, I guess, when I was teaching the material as well, this is much more what students brought to their sense of surprise about the novels was, something like a sense of ownership or participation in this longer timescale, more sort of back and forth history, and also a wider world. So that's roughly the and Meg, I don't know if you want me to just actually talk about the details, what it's, who it's about and all that.
Yes, you do, Sean, and I think perhaps also within the context of talking again about, I suppose, the other voices. So, I asked Yvonne to elaborate about the Jin voices that are not quite intelligible to us, but that still permeate. But I'm interested also, I think you make the point about following Michael Pearson about the fact that the Indian Ocean has been so relatively ignored because it's, Europeans entered so late, and it's largely inhabited and written about by, largely written about by people from around its shores, and part of so basically, writing the Indian Ocean Waters also to introduce different voices into world literature that are often not prevalent in it. Great for Nobel, gave it a bit of a nod now, but it's been a long time coming. And so I'm also interested in that as well.
Yeah, one of the things that I thought was fascinating in this response to Goethe's winning the Nobel, firstly, I mean, he's kind of classically again, to use Yvonne's word, laconic responses. He's just like, I was a bit surprised. But also that that in the write-ups about his work, because now everyone's sort of rushing to see what he's writing on, there's a terrible sense of desire to say, okay, Tanzanian novelist, Tanzanian, African, and really those categories don't work for his writing at all. Yeah. And other categories that I think some of us have suggested here, this kind of, also world literature doesn't completely work either. You can't say, it's hard to talk about Goethe's writing, like, as in world literature terms, like in relation to the South American novel. You could, but it's not where it's the world of the novel is. And so like either something like Meg's coastal, like it's a very coastal oeuvre, and it's also very oceanic in the sense that but eastwards oceanic, so not the kind of more well-written northern Atlantic, but much more, or even somewhat oceanic as in Pacific Islands. But this is just a very different set of connections that the novel invokes. So the furore around firstly how to get Gona's texts, which I've struggled with for years, but also then, and how to prescribe them because they're not in print, but also then, you know, how to categorize an author. And that's true of actually all the authors that I look at. So I look at Amitav Ghosh, and his pointing towards, which is again like an oeuvre that is very hard to categorize in its area of interest. You know, if this is the world of the novel, what is this the world we're most familiar with? Just kind of Europe as the center, with like South Africa to Europe, Kenya to Europe, Tanzania to Europe, trajectories? Or is this, you know, both writers very much just don't have that kind of north-south dynamic in the novels as much. I know there's a lot of north-south in Gona as well, but there's just like a much more like web-like set of trajectories and orientations in the work. And they all are doing what was mentioned earlier about, like, you know, that orientation, just that your eyes are turned towards the sea when you're at the coast. The novels also just have that kind of every now and then glimpse of the sea. And I think one of the parts of the first chapter, so the second chapter is on Ghosh, and third on Gona, and fourth on Lindsay Collin, who's also very hard to categorize, lives in Mauritius, very Mauritian, writes in Creole, from South Africa, and with a kind of very internationalist, socialist internationalist worldview. So I wanted to also take that history that maybe the Indian Ocean isn't massively written into the Western canon, because also all of these, and with caveats, are writers in English. And so the first chapter is really about actually, you know, is it a perspective thing that we categorize Melville as a Pacific writer of the Pacific and the Atlantic worlds, when actually, you know, right at the start of Moby Dick, the ship is supposed to go around South America and into the Pacific, and turns the other direction and goes around the Cape into the Indian Ocean and spends the bulk of the novel there. So it's headed towards the Pacific. That's the end point. But the kind of where a lot of the action takes place is in this Indian Ocean world. So there's a little bit of a pushback. Conrad, you know, we all think of Heart of Darkness, which is very West Africa, very Atlantic world. But the bulk of the novels as well are set in the Indian Ocean. And I also think of, you know, there's a slightly, the Indian Ocean isn't surrounded by any European white countries. I guess now Australia, maybe. But that's one of the reasons it's been a little bit overlooked, I think, as yeah, all of us are fairly familiar with.
Thank you, Sean. We'll perhaps come back to your Indian Ocean work, and perhaps also your Southern Ocean work later. I want to turn now to Isabel. I remember Isabel writing every now and then. Isabel was sending these wonderful little notes, you know, this little hint, look at this, look at that. Shouldn't we think of this as the Indian Ocean book? I remember some years ago an email popping up, isn't Moby Dick an Indian Ocean book? Shouldn't we be thinking of Moby Dick as an Indian Ocean book? As the first time it came into my framework in that sense. And so, you know, Isabel Hofmeyr, truly a pilot of Indian Ocean studies, also has a new book out early next year, Dockside Reading, and which locates, you know, two very intriguing procedures in the setting of the Customs House, hydrocolonialism and dockside reading. Isabel, I'll ask you if you can just talk us through this neologism, hydrocolonialism, which offers us a significant new conceptual framework, and perhaps also a little bit of an introduction to the new amphibious method that you perform, this reading through and on the dock, from the dock.
Oh, thank you so much, Meg, and thank you for convening this panel with such attention and care, and it's a great pleasure to be here with friends and colleagues. So let me just talk through first hydrocolonialism and give some very brief definitions. And maybe let me just say, in an absolute nutshell, it really is an attempt to think about land, water, empire, environment. So what it really tries to do is to say, okay, let's think about the huge hydrological cycle in relation to sort of imperial and post-imperial cartographies. And so once you think on that scale, you have to think obviously horizontally, you need to think vertically and volumetrically, and also you need to think contrapuntally about all of these different water worlds and hydro imaginaries that are drawn together by the construction of imperial and post-imperial space. Okay, so that's just very much in a nutshell what the term tries to do. Obviously, you can see it riffs off the term post-colonial. So post-colonialism and post-colonial theory attempts to understand literary and cultural production always in the framework of the lives and afterlives of empire and post-empire. So this term also tries to say, okay, if we're thinking about water and literary and cultural forms, we need always to do that, paying very close attention both to the water, but also to the imperial and post-imperial contexts. So as you can imagine, then it's a very portable term. It's a term with a very broad remit, and it invites people to sort of interpret and apply it, according to their own interests. So it could be very much, most obviously, about colonization by means of water, so maritime imperialism. It could be colonization, particularly of water, since so much land dispossession actually is about grabbing those bits of land that have a lot of water, particularly in drier settings and contexts. It could be about a colony on water, the ship as a colony, the penal colony. It could also very much be about water as a medium of colonization, so flooding and dam building. It could also be very much about the colonization of water below the waterline. So, port cities, coastal infrastructure, declaration of territorial waters, militarization of oceans, all of those sorts of features. And then also, I think very importantly, it's about the idea of the colonization of the idea of water. So it's, how does water come to be thought of as an empty secular substance? When in fact there are so many rich understandings, of waters, and Yvonne, for example, was talking about the jinns as characters in her novel. So arising out of particularly that last point, one really important idea is this idea of water, imperial or post-imperial water as always being creolized. So you have all of these very different ideas of what the water is, who's in it. In Southern Africa, for example, you would get Khoisan or First Nation ideas of water sprites and water spirits. African ideas of water is often certain kinds of water as the abode of ancestors. You get Muslim ideas of jinns, which Yvonne has spoken about. You get also, for example, maritime, British imperial maritime ideas as the oceans, as the realm of white manliness, and so forth and so on. So all of those ideas of water, encounter and interact and creolize each other. So that's an important theme. So that's just to give you some sense of what this term is intended to do and how it could be used. It just, in this book, what I've done is then taken these ideas in relation to print culture and the colonial port city. So as you can imagine, a lot of printed matter came from outside the colony and had to be funneled through the port city. And the place it went through was the custom house. So customs officials then checked printed matter coming in. So they were the first censors. They could decide something was seditious, obscene, or objectionable in some way and prevent it from entering. They also could decide if material was pirated or not. So they, in effect, became the first agents in a colonial setting to establish policies of copyright. So just much of the book then is these case studies of censorship and copyright. And this is a bit of a sidebar issue for this discussion. Much of what I do is look at print culture and book history. And, you know, that's one of the enduring interests that I've had. And obviously, as you can imagine, ideas of censorship and copyright are very central to these, you know, discussions of print culture and censorship, you know, those sorts of issues. And so any literary history, you know, these would be important issues. But in thinking about this, I thought, you know, these are always dealt with as very dry issues. You know, you think about censorship as happening in, you know, some building in some sort of authoritarian state capital. Copyright we think of really as, you know, the sort of noiseless rustle of paper through official offices and documents. And I was really interested to take some of the enduring concerns of print culture and see whether I could put them together with questions of ecological and elemental history. You know, so could I make the questions of book history, which are often literally quite dry, could I make them speak to these pressing questions of the Anthropocene? So really, just in a nutshell, I wanted to see, could I put water and paper closer together? Because, you know, we think about those two as very separate domains. And so, you know, just to give you a very sort of straightforward example, one of the ways in which censorship happened was if a book was deemed to be especially objectionable, it would be taken 3 miles out to sea and dumped. Okay, so you have suddenly an understanding of censorship which is elementally implicated, and that, of course, produces very you know, new understandings of what censorship is and how it could operate. And a lot of censorship is, you know, tied up with, in this case, drowning of books, and then the very well-known one is the burning of books. And so that I was interested in that. I was also interested then in to think about print culture as a kind of coastal infrastructure. So as you can imagine, in any port city, there's a huge amount of print culture. There are handbooks and manuals and forms and regulations and all sorts of things. So I also wanted to think about that as an interesting site. And so I was interested then in how all of this print culture in the port city forms part of a port city infrastructure, and also very interestingly becomes a kind of form of land reclamation, because what it does is it reaches out to land settlers of the right race and class, and to land objects that can be admitted to the colony. So I was interested in then thinking about both print culture, but also literary form, as particular kinds of literary form, as performing this work of reaching out and functioning as a kind of literary infrastructure or a kind of textual land reclamation. And then just on the theme of wet and dry, one of the things then is to say, okay, firstly, how do these customs officials actually read? How do they read in this elemental environment between land and sea? And then the book, and again, not absolutely relevant here, is the book is very interested in objects, because they deal with objects all day long, and they tend to read books as objects. So the book draws a lot on object theory. You know, that's a bit of a sort of sidebar. Again, if you're interested in that, you can have a look at the book. But on the theme of wet and dry, I became very interested in this idea of making something landed. And this was a big category in port city governance and regimes. And you can see it in the phrase landed immigrant. So a landed immigrant is an immigrant who is permanently and legally admitted. And you could see it also in like job descriptions. There's a thing called a landing surveyor in the custom house. There are also things like the tired surveyor and those sorts of categories. So I became interested then in this idea of one of their functions was to redeem things from the ocean and make them dry, okay? To give these things a dry landing and make them landed. And just as a footnote, I think there's an interesting kind of discourse in a lot of colonial ways of thinking about to be dry is to be civilized, to be quote unquote civilized. And this is often enacted in the port city itself, where, you know, settlers, for example, of the right race and class are sort of got to dry land, whereas you know, enslaved people or indentured workers or forced labor would be waist deep building breakwaters, and that the contrast of those is important. And then if I can just finally to round up, also I became interested in to think about all of this in relation to some of the big tropes of the South African novel. And I realized that once you looked at the port city and, you know, thought about its genres and the print, you know, all of its documents and forms of stuff that was going on there, it formed an interesting bridge between two major genres of South African literature, which is that of the shipwreck and that of the farm novel. So the shipwreck is obviously linked to the port because the port is meant to overcome the shipwreck. So it's meant to prevent further shipwrecks and to prevent then what is seen as the sort of catastrophic, you know, potential danger to maritime imperialism. But also the port city has this function of landing, you know, landing settlers, making them landed. And one of the trajectories of the settler, of course, is the farm. So that looks very much then to the farm novel. So this thing of the port city overcomes the shipwreck and then sends the settler on this trajectory into the farm novel. And I'll stop there.
Extraordinary. So I've popped the link into the chat because the introduction is currently available on the Duke website. And we're all waiting for the book. Sarah, can you put up the next slide, Rachel? I think it's, I've just put some, yeah, that's it. Sarah Nuttall has offered us very recently another extremely generative new concept to think wetness with, pluviality. And you note that the literary humanities have not paid much attention to the pluvial. I won't say what it is. I'll leave you to introduce it. It's a word I had to look up when I first saw it pop up in your writing. And that, you know, you've shown how this really has implications for how we think about narrative form and time. So can you talk us through your work of, as you put it, letting the waters in to literary critical practice and to and reading the ways in which the novel form has let the water in?
Yes, Meg, thanks so much. Just one little thing. There's a typical Johannesburg suburban noise going on. The neighbor's cutting down a tree. I thought he was mowing his lawn, and I think he's a he probably. There's silence for a minute, but just tell me if you can't hear me if it comes back. I was thinking alongside kind of literary ecologies and Isabel's hydrocolonialism and Sean's work on submergence. I think presented Sean in quite the early days at WISER, and started to think about you know, issues of rain, and thought initially about pluvial time, which was trying to give conceptual weight to how rain might work. And these pieces you see on the screen, to be honest, are very early attempts to start to think with rain that I don't particularly like in retrospect. But I feel as if I'm coming closer and closer to finding the novelistic resources with which to think about pluviality more substantively. So what I wanted to do was just tell you about how my thinking has developed in the last while around, you know, what novels have to say about rain. So first of all, one could, I suppose, think about pluvial time as a material condition. How does rain work? What does it do? And what does it do in relation to geology and history? So pluvial time thinks about heavy rain and flooding. I started thinking about pluviality, then thought about the kind of hyperbolic realism, Meg, that I think you mentioned in your notes to us, which is, well, the wet's getting wetter, the dry is getting drier. We are more presently pluvial than we were previously, it seems. Flooding is flooding futuristically, and so on. So this hyperbolic sense. No, I wonder if that's even true anymore. I mean, that was the sense 4 years ago when one was starting to do this work, but it's no longer hyperbolic. The wet is so wet and the dry is so wide that we're in it. So one might also want to reflect on the shifting temporalities of these timescapes that we're trying to work with close up. I think the other thing is we're now working with these kind of atmospheric rivers. You will have seen in the reporting on Canada this week, the massive atmospheric rivers in the sky that are shaping these weather systems, and that I was starting to think about in some podcasts earlier this year. So all of that was going on, and then trying to understand the relationship between rain and drought, and I think that's coming closer and closer for all of us as well. So, for example, fires make soil hydrophasic, and so this link between fires, drought, and floods is just I think tightening in all of our conceptualizations, whether we're reading the online newspapers or doing earth sciences research. I wanted to think about how you could then transport pluviality alongside the hydrocolonial and an iteration of the hydrocolonial, perhaps from the coast or the littoral inland, and started thinking with the Zambezi River Basin and Kariba Dam, because of the opportunity to think with Namali Circles, The Old Drift, which I think is a marvelous and very recent African novel. So then the question came, you know, how do you move away from representations of rain initially, which is where I kind of started thinking with Lindsay Collins' Mutiny, to how is a novel figuratively working with the pluvial, and that became much more interesting. So what I have to say is about Serpol's novel, but then I've just started looking at Coetzee, and I wanted to talk a little bit about Coetzee and how much rain and water there is in Coetzee, counterintuitively. So in other words, how you know, how does the novel form alongside the river, alongside rain and flooding, kind of surge and silt over and drift, and all of these vocabularies started to develop for me, and then just the pleasure of looking in discussion with Sean and Isabel in the context of the special issue of Interventions, which is coming out very shortly, and which Meg is contributing to, thinking about Bessie Head, thinking about how characters keep rivers inside themselves, how rain clouds gather even though not a cloud appears in the sky. So the sense of a complex material and moral imagination. And going back to Mia Couto, he has a short story called, a set of short stories called Rain, and the characters interrogate themselves and drip with water. So I kind of thought about a sort of a rain gauge reading of the novel, and then moved to Serpol to think about the Great Zambezi Basin, which influences the whole of Southern African waters, and the history of the Kariba Dam. And sorry, just finding a place in my notes. And so in this massive novel, Meg, I wonder if you read it. I mean, it's nearly 600 pages. There's a great deal about drifting and flooding, and their kind of material etymologies. And I've written a piece about that, which will come out in the Interventions special issue. And kind of noticing the novel's recurrent rain. and the degree to which that's completely missed, although it reigns throughout the novel by critics of the critics of the novel and reviewers, it's not mentioned at all. And how of course the human characters kind of narratively drift across the novel. The novel itself, in terms of its structure, pools and leaks and floods and stagnates like a silt-laden river. And there's this very strong sense of no origin, right? She has this phrase, the chaos of its capillarity. The novel's framed by the falls and the dam. And so the interest in the pluvial then segues into a whole range of different formations around the falls and the dam. And it absolutely is reading for what I've pointed to as letting the waters in, specifically via rain, triangulating a story of human history, hydrological cycles, and insect life in this context. I think the other thing that's embedded in the emerging work is how storm and flood events and conditions allow us to think about infrastructures differently. From where I'm sitting at WISER, some of the sort of most recent academic humanities scholarship has been around infrastructures. So what happens if you subject colonial infrastructures to wetness, to rain, and you start to think about earth infrastructures, as I've been calling them in a short piece, or infrastrucures drift. And what, of course, one finds is the limits of thinking about these structures from an engineering perspective, because there are all kinds of other dimensions going on if you start to look much more closely at river systems and how they work. So, for example, the kind of hard surfaces that engineers tend to build around dams to deal with flooding are absolutely disastrous because they can't absorb rain, they affect flows, and they give velocity to what I would call, in terms of my work, sort of potentially catastrophic pluvial time. So my argument is that we need to start thinking in terms of earth infrastructures. And in fact, the Circle book is just wonderful for the way in which it is both obsessed with engineers, but also short circuits the particular expertise of engineers. And what happens in the end is that the dam floods catastrophically, and the dam is returned to the river. And that's absolutely, of course, embedded in the kind of the revenge of the Tonga people who were unsettled, forcibly removed in order to build that dam. So there's a great deal about ancestral and geological time that I think we can continue to teach ourselves to resituate sort of coloniality's drift, I would say. And this is it's an extraordinary way to think about Southern Africa. So in all of these ways, I'm excited about where I think pluviality can take us, but it's absolutely embedded in all of these other conversations. And again, it's moving from the literal inland, but it's absolutely clear that Wile Mukherjee's idea of the hinterland as a seascape is operating, and that's what I'm finding in Coetzee. So I've been rereading Michael Kay and Boyhood, which have to be my two favorites. Haven't got back to Disgrace. Found 3 images that have just been published, which I'll share with you. But Meg, I'm very happy to do that in the second iteration of this conversation, if that suits you. So thanks a lot.
Yeah. Perhaps what we'll do now is just talk a little bit about aridity and then come back to. I think that's a good turn back. And I was so struck, Isabel, by your recent piece in Public Books, where you talk about how writers like Oliver Schreiner, firstly, and then more fully Bessie Head, have crafted drier literary forms as which to write the arid regions of Southern Africa. And you draw attention to the ways in which the English novel tradition has been, germinated in very damp climes and has evolved certain aesthetic demand for visible water that sits very uneasily in arid lands. You actually, in your conversation, I mean, in your essay, it's clear that this actually comes out of your thinking about how to read, that you develop, or what you learn about reading in the Southern Ocean. So you and Sean had this lovely conversation where you both try to read books while you actually traveling through the Southern Ocean, and it seems to be there that you notice that there's a whole lot of water in George Eliot, where you're surrounded by that water. So I wonder whether you can talk us through that sort of that genealogy of that observation, and what it means for how we think about the novel being imported and being adapted in new kinds of ways. It's no longer about mimicry and writing back, but really about refitting to an arid landscape, getting rid of all those pools and ponds.
Okay, thanks, Meg. I think it was, I mean, there's the very, very well-known thing by James Coetzee that the big problem in colonial South African literature is this lack of large reflective surfaces of water. So the aesthetics of landscape is deeply tied up, or the white British aesthetics of landscape are tied up with this idea that there has to be a large reflective surface of water, which forms the focus of many representations. And so there's been a whole, then very interesting work in how a lot of colonial literature tries then, in the absence of large reflective surfaces of water, tries to give form to formlessness. And so that's produced a kind of orthodoxy of its own. And a lot of, one conception of the South African novel is very much this, it's a narratives of the dry interior, drought is a huge trope. And that's become a sort of orthodoxy of its own. I think what we trying to do, Sean, Sarah and I, particularly in this new special issue called Reading for Water, are trying then to, I suppose, return to that in new ways, and then, to say, well, clearly this is important, but if you go into any novel, there is water, and where is that water, and what sort of work is it doing, and how does it impact on literary form? But I do think, just to rewind a bit, that the observation about the British novel was particularly set off by rereading The Mill on the Floss, which is just sort of overrun with water. The plot absolutely depends on water. It ends with a flood narrative. And you realize to what extent there are so much, I suppose, representations and linked to that forms of reading are deeply elementally embedded. So the question, and then that in a way came out in the piece that you say Sean and I wrote called Reading in Antarctica, where in those environments you become very clear that actually how and where you can read on a ship traveling from the Ushuaia at the bottom of Argentina to the Antarctic Peninsula is very determined by the elements.
Really intriguing. I wonder whether you want to talk a bit about your novel Dust, because you've written a novel that is set in a very arid part of Kenya, as well as one that's set in very coastal Kenya. And it's really quite interesting, because in both cases you sort of, writing from the margins of your nation. But I'm really interested in how aridity and drought structure that story, how they throw water into relief. Water is really, it's a sort of dreamscape in the novel because it's so rare and so absent.
Oh, Dust. Well, Meg, I guess the novel itself is underpinned by a longing for water, a longing for a relief from the dust. And of course, there are multiple metaphors linked to the idea of the aridity, but it's also very much about the aridity of the dream. It is a political novel, so it's the aridity of the original kind of post-independence dream, but the longing for relief that comes from rain, that I guess it does kind of appear at the end of the novel. But the story, again, is one of those things that was inspired entirely by landscape, by going to northern Kenya and going into these desertscapes next to a desert lake. But understanding that there are entire nations, the desert nations, find extreme life and fecundity in what a person not familiar with the space. What I look at and see, when I see desert and rocks, they see life. And that opens the space for us. I suddenly opened the kind of the realm within that says, what don't I see? What can I not see? What kind of knowledge, what kind of education would it mean to be able to inhabit this space and find not just life in it, find a way to thrive? And this cuts across you had children who were walking, who were traversing those landscapes for miles and miles. And traversing these landscapes with livestock. Somebody coming from the kind of Nairobi world would look upon these kids with a certain pity. Fortunately, that kind of nonsense is not a part of who I am. But and would be tempted to create the NGO project without taking space to understand what immensity was actually presenting itself before them. But I don't know what more I could say about this, but I guess it's like I said, it's about the political aridity, the loss even of the language of life in the political space. It was about a kind of familial aridity, the fecundity and thriving that was imagined for families, especially in the fantasy space that I treated Kenya almost as a fantastical space. The families that were supposed to be thriving enter into this realm of dysfunction. And of course, the landscape itself, the assumption of what gets obscured because of the dust storms, or the kind of dust in the eyes. And of course, very, very, very important was the idea that after all the mess, after all the chaos, this novel again was inspired by the risk we run into as a country in 2007, 2008, the awareness that one could lose a country without post-election violence, and the awareness that I think they say the Catholic right, dust to dust, from dust you come, to dust you return. After all the noise, the chaos, the madness, the hatred, ultimately, what happens to the human body after everything has taken place? It becomes dust, and it's not necessarily as a kind of accusative or condemnatory thing, but a kind of reality checking. But also the fact of dust as a part of the earth that gives life, the soils, the varieties of soils. It was also a tribute to all the soils, the colors of the soils of my own little country. When in the time of writing the novel, I became very aware for the first time, even though I'd lived with it for so long, that soil has so many colors. It's the most colorful site, the most colorful place. Dust too has many colors. So the dust of Tsavo is red. The dust of northern Kenya is a kind of beige with brown highlights. So and the world becomes this incredibly colorful place. So I guess that's the kind of the overarching concept around the dust in the novel.
Thank you. I think it's on your Nairobi TED talk, or when I first heard you talking about the novel before I read it, you were talking about rivers a lot, and I thought the novel would be all about rivers, and I was surprised when I finally read it that it wasn't. One of the things that you often talk about is how much rivers mean to you when you write, even though you aren't actually writing about rivers. And before we loop back to dryness, I wonder whether you can talk about that. You've spoken about River. You've spoken about the miserable rivers in Netherlands that made you. Yes. The Great Brisbane River, which you.
Absolutely.
While you're writing Monsoon, the Dragonfly Sea. So, unless I'm not sure everybody knows that the first draft of Dragonfly Seas was written in Queensland.
Yes. I've suddenly become aware, I actually became more aware that I need the river. Dragonfly itself, even though inspired by Brisbane River in its when it was a distant memory, but also motivated and moved by the Congo River itself. I was by the Congo River when all the parts seemed to come together. The web that I think, Sean, you talked about, I love the idea of the web of the fluidity, the web of fluidities that the waters offer us. So it's almost as if I do need a river before I can begin writing, or before a story is allowed to me. Maybe the kind of like the muse emerges from whatever rivers present themselves before me. And maybe it's part of 101's affectation, but I have to meet a river before, in whatever place, whatever land I go to. That becomes very important. And yes, that story I'd even forgotten. The first time I went to Europe, I'd gone to Breda, and it's the first time I met a river that had died, literally had died. And there's something so fragmenting within one's own spirit. And among these friends I was trying to impress, I burst into tears. It was a soup. The water was a soup. You had all these floating fish, the stench, the sense of loss, and it came from almost out of nowhere. The sense of the loss of this magnificent being, magnificent presence, and the loss caused by careless human beings. So I was my own kind of environmental awareness was not very overt at that time, but that changed everything for me in so many ways. It became the awareness of our role as custodians of spaces, of waters, in particular. But yeah, so there's my relationship with that river. I have a relationship with every river in the world, probably. So some somewhere in the offing, some have already been established. But yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting to me that even when it's not in the fiction, it's shaping it, it's informing it.
It really does. It really does. Yeah.
Should we, Sarah, turn to those Kasi photographs and what you wanted to talk about water and or dryness in his writing?
Yeah, I'd love to, but
those images, Rachel, sorry, can you get up those? It's just the last really lovely, thank you.
I was just listening to Yvonne, though. It reminded me of sending Isabel and Sean on our hydrocolonial WhatsApp group a picture of the Victoria Falls completely dry. Do you remember, Sean and Isabel? It was about 6 months ago.
Really?
Dry. They're flowing again, but it was an extraordinarily upsetting sight. I remember that very clearly.
It's impossible to imagine.
I know, but there it was, and we're all making our pilgrimages to Victoria Falls in the next few months because of that. Well, for me, partly because of that photograph. It was completely dry.
Because one of the things about being there is that before you can see it or hear it, you're drenched through all.
Yeah,
it's just so wet in the air. Yeah,
exactly. Imagine. Meg, I'd love to talk about Coetzee's novels for 5 minutes or so. I'll be very brief, and then I'll come to the photographs that I wanted to show you. One of the things that was extraordinary for me, partly in preparation for the special issue with Sean and Isabel, was rereading Michael Kay, and just to highlight some of the watery dimensions of that novel that again don't really appear at all in the vast sort of vast terrain of critical work on Coetzee. So the first thing perhaps to observe is that for the first 39 pages of Michael Kay, it pours with rain. It rains for 39 pages, and on the one hand, it seems to do so with the kind of force of a structural condition, because Michael Kay's mother is dreaming of escaping from the careless violence, the packed buses, the food queues, sirens in the night, the curfew, and the cold and the wet. But actually, Coetzee does also attend to something of its material specificity. For example, it's the combination of fine rain and mist on the escarpment that enables Kay to skirt a checkpoint as he heads away from Cape Town into the Karoo, and from the sort of carceral conditions of his life in the city. And I suppose one also has a sense in this novel, Meg, that despite all of Kay's attempts to keep his mother dry, pushing her in a wheelbarrow and covering her with canopies and plastic aprons, it's actually the rain that kills her just outside of Stellenbosch. So the force of that rain kills her. And then, of course, we find Kay in a dry riverbed near a lonely dam as a miner engineer wrestling with a dam pump in the Karoo, and trying to work a borehole so that he can grow the pumpkin seeds he has in his pocket. And then just sort of two concluding scenes that are useful for the very quick argument I want to make, which is that in captivity again, the medical officer tries to invent a story for him and does so oceanically, and so says, you're like a coelacanth. And there's really no home left for you except in Antarctica. So this amazing invocation of the oceanic to think about Kay. So in fact, rain and riverbeds and inland seas and dams and boreholes and southern oceans, pass this text with wetness and neglected critical waters. And the very last thing is Kay peering into those tidal pools at Sea Point when he returns to Cape Town. And he looks at the snails and the anemones living lives of their own, and wishes and starts to imagine on the very point of his death, to imagine living a life of his own outside of those discourses of charity case and vagrant in Cape Town, as the sea creatures do. And so, as the novel closes, of course, he's got a teaspoon in his pocket and a string, and he's off to the hinterlands again. So the sense, as I said earlier, that the hinterland becomes a sea space is really very powerful. So just talk about Boyhood for 1 second. So Boyhood is interesting. Boyhood, for those of you who haven't read it, although I assume most people have, is Coetzee's childhood memoir. And it's a strangely weatherless book on first sight. So because and that seems to reflect the form of the novel, which is his obsession with his inner self, it seems. The weather's irrelevant, doesn't care. Life in Worcester is appalling at the beginning. And it does sort of rain so heavily that the rain stands in pools in the yard. But after that, there's no more discussion of weather, except for one moment, when he says that, and in fact, I haven't noticed it before, but this exact sentence is repeated by Coetzee several times. As for him, he wants to be a creature of the desert, this desert like a lizard. So this hydrophasic kind of movement in Boyhood. And then, and I'll finish here, he tries not to drink because he wants to become a lizard, and he's proud of how little he drinks. And then there's really a scene just above the farmhouse. There's a stone-walled dam, and Stony Time he talks about water in the novel, filled by a wind pump, which provides water for the house. And on a hot day, he and his brother get into a galvanized iron bath tub and float around the dam, and it's the first time that he feels safe. So finding all these references to sea and water in this incredibly dry Coetzee work, I think has been exciting for me. And then I don't know how many of you know, sort of last year in the middle of the pandemic, this book of photographs came out, edited by Herman Wittenberg. And this is the dam at Fontaine. And I don't want to reduce our literary imaginations by making it literal, but of course, I'm going to be looking at this photograph closely. There's the dam pump in the corner. I know some of those dam pumps from my own childhood. That's his brother walking towards it. And then, of course, the aridity in the background of the Karoo, which is so powerful. So I'm only just beginning to work with these photographs. I don't know how many of you have seen them, but there it is, literalized for us in some respects. And of course, Coetzee returns to that dam, his literary imagination throughout Kay, in Disgrace, I would imagine, in Boyhood, and probably in a number of his other novels. If you could just turn to the other two slides, to think with aridity in the photographs, the next one, and then the next one which is the figure of Freek, who's clearly related to Michael Kay, makes the first trip to Strandfontein, which would have been a beach for coloureds only, from the Karoo farm.
The last one, Rachel. The last one.
Yeah. So just some content there for rethinking.
Sorry, the one of the two figures on the beach. Sorry.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, Sarah.
Fine. So I'm working a lot on sort of wet hinterlands and thinking about these circuits between inland dam and segregated beach in relation to some of Coetzée's work, and it's been very, really, really exciting to think with. So thanks a lot.
I'm so intrigued also by this particular photograph. It's taken just before the beaches are segregated, right? I think. And it's, and the caption, I don't know if everyone can read what they thought of it. I will never know. They turned away from the camera. It's so intriguing to me. This is the very beach that in the follow-up to Boyhood Youth, when he's left these provincial southern lands behind and gone to the metropolis, it's the one moment where there's this longing for home, and it arrives as a thought in a terrible English winter. It could be summer now, I could be running on the beach, on Strandfontein Beach. It's this very beach. And it's this evocation of a hemispheric difference. I could be in the south now, and it's a certain kind of, I could be on this space. But this is a very complicated image. It's, you can read that scene quite simply, and then if you read it against this very complicated image of these two characters turned away, what I think is inaccessible to us, it's a very, very fascinating scene of what's happening. So, I read that scene as marking southness as a literal condition. But that's not to in any way answer the question of what that means. It's to ask the question, because this is asking what is that? What do these places mean? That's really
thanks. I've read your essay on that, and I'm going to be drawing on that strongly and trying to make an argument here, Meg. Thanks.
We saw some of us in Adelaide would have seen the photos a few years ago. Herman exhibited a selection of them for us, but I don't think that we would have the book yet because the writer's not arriving at the moment. I want to pick up on that. Also extraordinary to have you draw all the attention to all the rain and Michael Kay, because I always think of it as a dry book. I always think of it through the ending. I always think of it as a book that can only spare a teaspoonful of water, and yet you've shown us that it's full of water. But that I want to pick up on that quote that the only proper place for him is Antarctica. And I want to turn back to Sean, who's works on the Indian Ocean, but also works a lot on Antarctica, on thinking about Africa and Antarctica together, on thinking through the Southern Ocean, on thinking the world from a penguin's point of view. So, Sean, would you like to talk to some of that work?
Yeah, thanks, Meg. And this is actually, the first second I saw this photograph, I thought, oh, that looks icy. It's got those kind of white colors, possibly, penguin's point of view. But to I guess pick up on the question you asked to both Isabel and I about what the embodied experience of reading in Antarctica on the Southern Ocean offered to a sense of what reading is. And one of the things that struck us very, very viscerally was that I think I'd always sort of thought, if we're thinking about this hydrophagia, Margaret Cohen and others have written about it, that society is quite turned away from the sea, not just post-independence African nations, but that our experience of the maritime is quite limited. I think I had that experience on the ship, 2 days out of sight of land, and then just realizing that that's the first time that's ever happened to me, and in my mind, I don't think of myself as a hydrophasic person or someone that's been completely landbound, but in fact, I hadn't been, maybe been on a cruise ship or something, like I haven't been out of sight of land. And that sense of just like, okay, now we are here, the sea is very rough. It's affecting how, we're holding our books, how we can read, what our perceptual capacities are, you know, that your vision is blurred, the words on the page aren't quite sticking together, but also that actually the sea is vast, and you know that in abstract terms, but not quite so much in the visceral way that became apparent. And then the other thing that was very clear was that we'd never been that far south, and you know, you're kind of doing geography in school, and you know that things go a bit awry. You know, you can use a compass, but not when you get close to the poles. And that was very clear in the Southern Ocean and closer to Antarctica, that, you know, where south, the magnetic south and the geographic south were just completely, actually quite far away from each other. When we were looking at the map, you know, just as the little ship was doing its journey across the map, that notion of that the south is at the bottom and the north is at the top, got really higgledy-piggledy in my mind, because actually wherever we were moving, south was at the middle and the north was the whole edge of the map. So that kind of south centrality of as we were moving through the sea, I think it's had quite a lasting impact on a sense of reading. And we've all seen the upside down map of the world and that kind of thing, but that sense of a completely different configuration for North and South, not just that they're inverted, but that they have a really different orientation to one another, and that the South is possible to be central. So those were a couple of the things that were evident from the trip. But the other one was, you know, the melting of the ice was very visible. The tour guides were just saying, okay, well, the ice shelf came up to here last year and was there the year before and was there the year before. You know, it's not a long time scale anthropocenic geologic time for the people that are there. That sense of being on the palpable end of climate change was very present. And when I've done some work also with trying to work across these disciplinary boundaries between the humanities and the sciences, on how to story climate change. Amitav Ghosh definitely is kind of leading in this area. How to story futures that might actually be hopeful in this rather dystopian, melting, dry, flooding future. So I've been involved in some of the writing of the African chapter of the IPCC report, the International Panel on Climate Change. And the African chapter was then kind of spoken about. The African scientists that were involved in the first part of the report, which is on physical sciences, talked about, okay, how do we think about the consequences for where we live now here? So Johannesburg, this is Johannesburg-based scientists. And they said, well, we have to think of Johannesburg's day zero, similarly to the one Cape Town had. Cape Town nearly ran out of water based on a pretty unprecedented drought. It wasn't just sort of mismanagement of dams, etc. It was really that it would have been hard to predict a drought of that nature. And so it's worth anticipating a Johannesburg day zero, which is kind of the link between the total, you know, water everywhere, not a drop to drink in the Southern Ocean, and the possibilities of drought and the links between those two. So I think your point about that dipole, that if there's drought here, there's floods here, you know, that there is this kind of unbalanced balance between a very kind of east-west sense of this part of the South. So I guess one of the things that has led me to think about is taking a rather literal and slightly unappealing version of Astrida 9 minuses. You know, we are bodies of water. Yvonne also mentioned this. We are bodies of water. I felt like very fluid bodies of water on the waves of the Southern Ocean, you know, just a bit amorphous. But also that we have to think about ways of reclaiming water from drought, from becoming waste. I'm increasingly interested in the deep ocean as well as the Southern Ocean, and they're very much linked in their outsideness, outside of our realms of both experience and imagination. But but not outside of the realm of impact. And one of the ways, certainly with the deep ocean, and Meg, I know you've written about this, surfing on the coast of Cape Town, in a way that a lot of sewage is pumped into the deep sea, and that happens all over the world, not just in the global south. I guess I've been thinking a lot about how to think dryness and sewage in the South African novel, so wastewater, and also how to think of the kind of ways of conceiving of water as outsiders, hinterlanders, I guess beyond the scope. And those things are linked through the body, through the body and its fluidities. So this comes partly from a novel, in one of Gerner's novels, Admiring Silence, in which the main character kind of goes and sees the infrastructural chaos of the post-colony, the scatological, blocked toilets, etc., and says, I'm going to become a plumber. So this notion of plumbing and infrastructure as linking across the pipe into the deep sea and the reclaimed water from wastewater in the arid inland cities. Yeah, so a whole bunch of thoughts linking dryness and wetness. Meg.
And what I meant to say at the beginning when I introduced you, and I said you're from Johannesburg, I meant to say you're one of the largest and most significant dry ports in the world. That's one of the things. Johannesburg is a significant dry port, but now also obviously in a potentially catastrophic sense with day zero looming. I want to at this point just open to see whether members of the audience would like to ask any questions or make any comments about wet and dry. Certainly, we're talking largely about Southern and East African examples and down to Antarctica, but there's certainly much that's resonant with the writing of wetness and dryness on this side of the Indian Ocean. And if not, we can continue speaking, but if anybody would like to come in at this point, if you could just put your hand up so that we can see, or put a comment in the chat. And Michelle, did you want to speak to the question of how bodies of water are raised? You want to unmute Michelle?
Yeah, I see what
you mean.
No, it's really great to sort of have this panel, especially following on from the last panel. I felt like I want to say this, right? I feel like as a woman of colour, it's so important that white people are listening to what we say, because I don't feel I really expressed myself properly in the last session about what I meant about looking at the ways that literature is oppressing people, literature as an instrument of oppression in the fact of the dominance of Western literature, Western publication. And Isabel, you talk about that in terms of censorship and in terms of your point about like the print culture in port cities as a kind of like filter in a way, a filter that is an aspect of the colonial machinery. And I feel like, the dominance of Western literature and the dissemination of it and the filtering of that into education is a way of oppressing so many other voices. And what that actually ultimately does, if you think about water, if you think about the trickle-down effect, it is not really probably visible or palpable to white people what the impacts of that are, because they don't experience it. They are living on layers and layers and layers of colonial privilege and centuries of colonial privilege that is based on the economic, social and political oppression of people, and literature plays an important role in that. The people that are oppressed are brown and black people, and literature plays an important role in that. So I'm really glad that this panel is raising these important issues. And I wish I'd sort of expressed that a little bit more eloquently in the other one. And I think it's sometimes the fact of like, you know, as a brown person, a brown writer who's sort of, I do a little bit of critical work sometimes, but I like to think of myself mainly as a writer. But if you're kind of on a panel, sometimes you kind of lose your voice, you know, you can't, you feel kind of a bit outnumbered in a way, especially I think in an Australian setting. So I'm glad to sort of do this and have this aired, because I think that it needs to be sort of confronted. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. Michelle gave an extraordinary reading last night from her forthcoming novel, Daisy and Wolf, and speaking to that a little bit. And part of what this is doing is also, again, recovering the spoken over characters, the characters whose stories have been scripted for them or written out, and putting them back into the center of the narrative. And she was talking really interestingly earlier about how stream of consciousness has been appropriated as a white form, and that's very interesting because, of course, it's again the figure of water. So I think we're all really looking forward to that novel. Would the panelists like to comment on this point, or any other members of the audience? Killian, could you unmute you? Thank you.
Sorry, Mick, can I just comment on that briefly before we move to Killian? Hi, Killian. The question of, I guess, the relationship between one of the effects of writing and teaching on Indian Ocean literature is to reframe, for instance, Africanness and Blackness as not disassociated from water. That there are, in fact, histories of maritime exploration, swimming, diving, watery engagement, which I think is, I guess what Michelle is saying is that is really written out of the narrative, and it is a form of literary and imaginative oppression to exclude those kinds of experience. There's a fabulous book about aquatic experience and imaginaries in the transatlantic world, the use of skills in diving, free diving, that was one of the kind of primary skills that slavers required of African enslaved people. So, I think there's something very important about linking, obviously, certainly in the context of South Africa, but also in relation to these global South questions across Australia, South America, and the rest of Africa, of linking questions of water with race, and acknowledging that, as has been certainly a critique leveled at any environmental turn, that as soon as the question becomes about who owns the land, we segue to the question of water, but thinking actually instead with Isabel's centralizing that water can also be colonized, and it also has decolonial histories.
Killian, you unmuted.
Hi everyone. Okay, great. Thanks a million. This panel has been just phenomenal. Thanks so much, Meg and organizers, and thanks to everyone. I've learned so much. I'm speaking from Melbourne on Wurundjeri land, where it's been weirdly dry for like about a week and a half. And when the rain came this afternoon, it was very welcome until the point at which it started dripping through the ceiling of our front room. And so this felt to me like, a case of pluvial longing that was satisfied until it became dissatisfactory, not in a kind of catastrophic way, but in a kind of disappointing or maybe ambivalent way. And so thinking about what Yvonne was saying about aridity, and also thinking about what Sarah was saying about catastrophe, I'm wondering if either of you or any of you others would be up for talking about the pluvial's kind of other registers. That is to say, what comes after aridity and what kinds of affects, what kind of registers the rain brings. Thanks very much.
Would you like to respond to that, Sarah?
Well, I'd like to hear Yvonne on rain, and then I can come in after that, if Yvonne would like to.
No, quite seriously, Sarah. I was eagerly waiting for you. I loved I loved everything you had to say. I kind of immersed myself. I fell under its spell. So it's I'm mulling over the thoughts you've absolutely provoked, and the idea of rain within us as well. I mean, you've thought a lot about this, so I think it's only right to hear from you. And yeah, the aspect of catastrophe. Just very quickly, we've been waiting for, well, even though I'm in Berlin, I kind of follow up what is happening in Kenya. We had been longing for rain for the last 2 months, and the northern lands had been particularly affected. So rain came 3 days ago, but it came in such torrents that floods. So you had the children playing, and then suddenly the rivers showing up. You know, the Lagos turning into the great, incredible rivers, sweeping away both animals and people. So so together with the fulfilled longing is also I think what Killian referred to, the catastrophe. But yeah, back to you, Sarah.
Okay. So one of the things that the novel works with is the sort of deep ambiguities of colonialism's and modernity's sort of mega structures. And so, for example, these huge hydrocolonial dams. And it would probably be interesting in your region to think about where those dams are and what happened if they flooded. And so one of the things to think about directly from fluviality is which dam is likely to flood, and when it floods, where will we recede underwater? Where will some people recede underwater? And you know, so interesting how it's etymologically sort of built into the name Kariba, which I think is a Tonga word for the dam, which was nevertheless built by Rhodesians at the time. You know, Kariba means a sort of a trap for the river. Now, the Kariba Dam in this region is facing huge infrastructural neglect, and what Serpil does is she works with that and gives it a kind of Afrofuturist tilt. So what if this dam overflows? And it's something that scientists are debating at the moment. And essentially what would happen is it would flood across 7 African countries and arrive at the Indian Ocean. And in the very last part of this particular novel, kind of the floodplain is underwater. So I'm trying to think about, sorry, how to answer your question best. But one of the ways of thinking about the registers of fluviality is in relation, I suppose, to these mega dam structures that were so much part of the legacy of modernity and colonialism across the settler colonies of the South. And what happens when you put rain and flooding together with dams, and those dams break their walls? Where would that water go? What does the floodplain look like? The other thing to think about in relation to rain, which Yvonne might like, is in relation to puddles as many dams, because puddles are not only what mosquitoes like, and of course the rain brings with it certain kinds of insects. Mosquitoes, I think, are the most ancient of all. But puddles have very interesting sort of material kind of etymologies and structures. And so if one thinks about puddles as mini dams, which are then flooded during rain, one might think about some of the consequences of losing those puddles and microsystems. So you can see that I'm trying to think with rain, early days still, but these might be some of the ways, to think about it. So it's not only the rain coming through your ceiling, but what's happening to the dams in your area and what's happening in the puddles that engineers and other humans freely walk through, destroying quite intricate biospheric systems that those engineers should probably have looked at more carefully. So all of these kinds of things are fascinating to think with. But it's also, I suppose, it goes to the Latourian points that we never were modern, and that modernity's megastructures are increasingly failing. And one of the registers in which we might think about that are the registers of pluviality and pluvial time, as we try to deal with the kind of catastrophic planetary and so on. But others of you might have better things to say than me about rain at this point.
May I?
Yes, please do.
Because you said puddles, Sarah, I wondered, first, as a child, I used to skip into puddles, but I wonder what is it about the rain that sometimes, actually, I don't think I've ever seen a group of children not having the sense of joy when the rain comes, the kind of longing to go and terrorize their parents by coming back all muddy and messed up. But also, and then adults, when the rain comes, kind of huddle into a coat or try to avoid the experience. Maybe it's about embodiment, but since you're thinking through rain and thinking in rain, what would you attribute to that?
Just didn't hear the last part of your question. Since I'm thinking about rain, what?
Since you're thinking about rain, why is it, for example, why do we lose the sense of the joy and the wonder and the jumping into puddles as we grow up? That the children do. I've never run across a group of children who have never experienced rain as an opportunity to play, to look for the puddle, and this exuberance at the appearance of this.
I'm sure Sean has an excellent answer.
Sean.
Well, I was thinking about that. Absolutely ridiculous. I mean, to slightly point to both questions, that this the range in which human life is possible is very, very narrow, and human joy is possible is like microscopic length. It's like, oh, hooray, rain! Oh no, now it's terrible immediately. And similarly, I mean, Stefan Helmrich has written about the limits of life. That we can live within this many degrees and this much water, and we need that exact amount. So even thinking on a kind of astrobiological, when looking at other planets for different forms of life, we often look to the undersea to see, actually can life survive at much greater pressures and at much wetter temperatures and in much more water than we thought. But that this thing where, our species and what our limits of life and status and comfort, as Killian was saying, are just so incredibly narrow. I think it's what we're thinking when we're thinking about climate change, is that it actually sounds very small. 2 degrees doesn't sound so big, but it changes everything because we have this we're walking a sort of tightrope of the form of life we're familiar with.
And let's perhaps just remember that 2 degrees on a global scale means over 3 for Africa and Australia, because it's also worse.
Yeah, here as well. So Southern Africa and Australia really have, the rest of the world's actually getting a little bit damper, but we're just getting drier, certainly in the interiors of these continents. Can I just answer one question also in the chat, Meg?
Yes, about the
yeah, about and just 2 very quick points on this point. The question is about of novelists writing hope in relation to climate change. So one project I'm involved in is a project based at WITS at the Global Change Institute called African Futures, and it's about taking the dominant paradigms of future scenario planning, which use techniques like science fiction, but are completely dominated by Western, white Western male, etc. narratives, and trying to bring on board African science fiction authors in order to use the science fiction techniques for scenario planning and to think through both futures that are relevant at all to the African context and more widely in the global South, but also to try and what they are developing is what they call seeds of any kind of hopeful futures. It's very easy to imagine the dystopic futures. I think this is beginning to happen in very small ways. I can think of one story, Mahale Mashigo, who writes about the submerged future on the coast of Southern Africa, in which the coast is already 20 or 30 meters further underwater, and the holiday houses on the coast have been reclaimed as underwater homes for people who used to live on the coast, had been displaced because of racialized beach laws, and were coming back to live underwater in this kind of future imagined world, and to think of themselves as guardians of marine creatures, etc. So it's not a completely, none of these stories are completely idealistic, but I think there's the beginning of something, and in that submerged future, that too much rain, as Killian was talking about, and too much melted ice, there is still some way of linking a past of oceanic engagement in the local arena to a future that is at least alternative to just doom and gloom.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder whether, thank you, Sean, and part of this, I suppose, is also part of the vertical turn in your thinking. I'm thinking about the undersea, not just about the sea as a surface to cross. I wonder if we could just turn back to the question. Nick, would you like to ask your question in person? Could you unmute Nick, Rachel, Nick Joes? Because I'm really also quite interested in that question of returns that are both, and we spoke also about the temporality of them, but also this. I think Sean, you picked up on that it's a return rather than a going back, but also but let's talk about the novel now and its reception in China. And there's also, you tracing relations, but you're also tracing fractures and points of critique. And there is also there's a subplot in it about wildlife. Yeah, I don't know whether you want to talk to that at all, and whether there's been any commentary on that in the reception. And
okay.
Yeah, thank you. I'd love to hear anything about that. I mean, extraordinary that it's the DNA testing that has enabled this story. And then in the pandemic, there's been the return to China of pangolin, et cetera, So these strange intersections of contemporary sort of science and hope and anxiety, and your story of China's return to Africa, but then Africa's return to China. How's that gone, in literary terms for your novel?
Thank you for your question. Actually, the first Chinese version is going to come out next year. It's been quite an interesting year for me when the novel was found, so to say, by one of the two Chinese universities, and that were doing a whole kind of global study of Anglophone, particularly Anglophone literatures. And they happened upon this book, and then suddenly my email was full. I had my email inbox was full of these emails from all sorts of interesting young, but also some of their teachers talking about this novel with such excitement. So as a consequence of that, yes, it's going to be it is being translated by a committee, a group, and it will be published next year. But what I've most enjoyed has been an ongoing ongoing exchange and conversation with some of the young scholars and their teachers around themes. They immerse themselves so deeply into this and cause me to think all over again and also learn new things and find these incredible correlations and connections which I had also missed. And yeah, so it's both been very humbling but also very moving. And I was struck that one of the things that surprised them the most was they had assumed they'd almost been afraid of reading it because they thought it was going to be, you know, the stereotype out in the world about the Chinese presence in Africa, that they would run into that. So they were particularly struck that the protagonist from China is, in the words of one of them, a sexy man. So it's been fascinating, and we've got reams and reams of this back and forth, the ebb and flow of question and insight and yeah. So I mean, certain references that I had made just for the sake of the story, you know, suddenly have impact. So the main character going into pottery, I'm being told, actually makes me sound very, very clever, as if I'd done all this research, but I hadn't. So I mean, it's been good, and it will be out next year.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Is there any last question before I wrap up? I think, unless, let me first, invite the panelists if they would like to make any closing comments or closing openings, closing ambits. Otherwise, I am going to close this. We did have a 2.5-hour session beforehand. This has been absolutely extraordinary. So I haven't felt the fact that we had 2.5 hours beforehand, but I'm just conscious that the time is passing. My dream panel, I miss you all very much. I wish I could be in a room with you. But thank you so much for coming. Your concepts are so generative, your books are so generative. I've been putting things into links. Please follow up, please read. We're waiting for Sarah Nuttall's book on pluviality that will be following very soon, we know, after all those wonderful articles, but follow the links to the articles in the meantime. And we're looking forward to the next round, what's going to come next, what you're going to lead us into next. I'm just going to say good night, or good morning, good day to you.